You're listening to episode 53 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Tom Clark speaks with us about his book, Encountering Naturalism, A Worldview and Its Uses. How do we, as secular Buddhists, clarify that line between what we experience in the real world and what we may tend to discount as mysticism? Secular practice does have that inclination away from the supernatural. We may have experiences which seem to indicate that mystical interpretations about reality are correct, but when we critically examine these conclusions, we see they may not be so. Correlation is not causation. And my meditative experience of Manjushri doesn't mean Manjushri is a living being. The brain we rely on can be innocently mistaken, and that means the person we conventionally view as ourselves can conditionally also be innocently mistaken. But what do we call this realm of the real? What is the worldview and term that captures our leanings? The scientific method is a method. Critical thinking is a tool. Skepticism is an ideological stance. The worldview and term I've started to use with more frequency is naturalism, and, as we'll hear about in today's interview, is in perfect alignment with the secular Buddhist practice. Tom Clark is founder and director of the Center for Naturalism, a non-profit advocacy organization in the Boston area devoted to educating the public about naturalism, policy development, and community building. He is the editor of the popular online website, naturalism.org, which is among the web's most comprehensive resources on scientific naturalism, its implications, and its applications. He is also author of Encountering Naturalism, A Worldview and Its Uses. So, sit back, relax, and have, hot chocolate today, I think. It's snowing again. And the guest today is Tom Clark. Tom is the author of Encountering Naturalism, A Worldview and Its Uses. Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Ted, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Very glad to. We were just chatting before starting the interview itself, and it seems that we have a few folks in common. You're associated with the Center for Pragmatic Buddhism, as I understand it, and you will be seeing our friend Sean Faircloth of the Secular Coalition for America in a few weeks. So say hi to Sean. It'll be good chatting with him, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, this confluence of influences and organizations. I didn't actually expect that when we started talking, but here we are. You, a secular Buddhist, and Sean Faircloth, the I think director of the Secular Coalition of America, which includes, humanists and atheists and ethical humanists, and myself as a naturalist, and now soon a secular Buddhist organization, as you explained it to me, which I think is fantastic.
We're hoping. That's the idea, because it's all about, I think, for many of us, having a mutual respect for how people pursue their spirituality, and we'll talk about that word, because some people listening right now are going, said the S word. We'll chat about that. And having that it's okay to have a non-mystical or supernatural spiritual practice, that's okay. We can do that and still be good moral people.
Right, and actually, Sam Harris has been an advocate of using the S word, which I'm actually fairly pleased with him for doing that.
I am as well. Have you read? I've been reading his new book, The Moral Landscape. Have you looked at that yet?
Yes, I have. He's got a very good 10-page section on free will about his general thesis of whether science can determine human values. I think that's a little sketchy, but
I've had some points where I thought, "Oh, Sam, I got to think about this a little bit more because I know you're at least twice as smart as I am, so you have something up your sleeve, but I don't quite get it yet. Give me time."
Well,
there.
Sam hopes to have with one blow cut the Gordian knot of his ought distinction. I don't think he's done it though. I think it's a little subtler than he makes it out to be. But anyway, that's a topic for another day.
And excellent. So I'll sign you up for that podcast episode. That'll be great. Thanks. So what I want to do is ask you about how you came to having this passion about naturalism, and let's get to that as kind of the build up to what naturalism is. Let's not define it quite yet, because that's one of the topics we need to talk about.
Well, it started, I guess, when I encountered Alan Watts and his wonderful East-West writings. You may know his stuff, The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, and others of his books. I encountered them and found him to be a very persuasive advocate of Eastern philosophy, but with a sort of rational Western slant. So not too mystical, but still intriguing. So I investigated him, then discovered Buddhism per se, and did some of that. And I think, like many people, I was very much enthralled by the idea that Buddhism and other Eastern traditions offered a kind of ultimate permanent solution to the problem of life, of suffering. And so, like I think many folks, I got caught up in the meditative route of say Zen, and the mystical tradition of the perennial philosophy, of supposing that there could be a permanent, all-encompassing solution to the problem of life and suffering through, say, mystical experience or meditation. And then but that didn't actually work. Unfortunately, there it was. It didn't work for me. And then shortly after that, I discovered Daniel Dennett at Tufts University, who was a philosopher of mind, right?
His book, Consciousness Explained, is sitting about 3 feet behind me. Yeah.
Right, and his book Brainstorms, which was out then, and Tufts is nearby where I live, and I applied to study there. So actually, I got in on the strength of a manuscript called Buddhism, Behaviorism, and the Myth of the Autonomous Self.
That's awesome.
Which I want to scan sometime and put online, because I think it still holds true pretty well.
That's right. I was going to ask you if we could get that linked on the webpage of the episode.
Yeah,
it's scanned in. Let me know. I'll put it on.
Yeah. I should say that the other half of the story, which I haven't mentioned yet, was B.F. Skinner, a behaviorist who was widely reviled, of course, and by many, unfortunately, because he's vastly misconstrued. But he was actually the Humanist of the Year in 1972, as voted by the American Humanist Association. B.F. Skinner was a tremendously enlightened individual who understood that the human beings are completely caught up, enmeshed in and part of the natural causal continuum, just the way Buddhists think about it. There is no substantial self that stands apart from cause and effect. Skinner understood this from a behavioristic perspective. So what occurred to me was that to look at Alan Watts and B.F. Skinner and Buddhism and put them together in this sort of East-West critique of the idea of the autonomous self, as B.F. Skinner described it, the self that supposedly stands above causation. That being one of the central myths of Western culture. And so what Buddhism does and what behaviorism does, both in their different ways, is to naturalize the human agent. And so I wrote this monograph, Buddhism, Behaviorism, and the Myth of the Autonomous Self. and sent it to Dennett, and he liked it well enough and said, sure, come on by, let's talk. And so I studied with him for a year. I wasn't actually very good at philosophy, but it stuck with me. So I didn't get my MA or PhD in philosophy, but I've nevertheless been a how shall I say a very enthusiastic autodidact and reader in philosophy, and have published a bit in Consciousness and other magazines. Of The Humanist has many articles that I've written, and many of which are about this sort of central theme of the critique of free will, basically, because I see that as libertarian contra-causal free will as one of the central myths of false beliefs in Western culture. And that's the other half of naturalism. We have atheism, of course, which critiques the supernatural God, and then the myth of free will, of supposing we're separate or riding above causation. That those two things are the two halves of what I think of as a comprehensive naturalism about ourselves and about the external world. So that's a bit of the story of how I got interested in naturalism. The thesis that we are completely natural creatures, which from a Buddhist perspective means there's no Atman, right? No substantial self sitting in there, controlling action. And then from behaviorist perspective, there's no autonomous man, as Skinner said. Although there are naturalistic, important naturalistic ideas about autonomy that we want to hold on to, that are valid. And then looking at Western philosophy and David Hume, the philosopher David Hume, his critique of the self, same thing. And Dennett and other philosophers, naturalistic philosophers, who developed over the 20th century basically a science-based philosophy of mind that shows that human beings, in fact, don't have a special causal exception from nature. We're fully part of the natural world in our behavior, in our choosing, and our deciding, in who we are. So it's that insight that we are completely a part of the natural world, I think, is somewhat still missing among atheists and secular humanists. They haven't fully grasped the full implications of a naturalistic worldview as I see it.
Mm-hmm. And, I agree with you, and it's, as you're speaking, the things I was thinking of is, okay, so we're shooting down the idea that there's an homunculus in my head driving the machine that's my body. Cool, with you there. And we don't have a get out of causation free card. We don't, and that's perfectly in keeping with this. And one of the things I wanted to read is, you were talking about naturalism. Nothing new, a brief history of naturalism. And you talk about the Greeks and the Buddha, and I just want to read a couple of sentences from your section on the Buddha. Is that you say the Buddha's claims about existence and the self were incorporated into a very practical and naturalistic ethics. Compassion for ourselves and others is gained by seeing the truth of our impermanence and interdependence. No supernatural moral imperative is necessary. Beautifully said. Well done.
Well, why, thank you. I think it's hard to boil everything down to a few words, but I think that's an important the sort of the ethical implications of seeing ourselves naturalistically are what the Buddha captured so importantly. I mean, he didn't talk about it that way, but he was, I think, kind of an empiricist about human experience. He wasn't a scientific empiricist. He probably had, who knows what he really thought, but he might have had some strange beliefs about things that scientists might have taken him up on. But he was an empiricist about experience and about the dissolution of the self, how the self arises and then disappears. He was right on, and he saw that we're all kind of equal in this situation, and therefore equally deserving of compassion and understanding. No one can set themselves above anyone else, I don't think, on his view. So he really got it. And of course, there have been a lot of distortions and divergences from that central insight over the years since the Buddha lived, and the rebirth, incarnation, and sort of the supernatural excrescences that have been added on, but absent those, I think the Buddha really did see an extremely important fact about ourselves that is held up and is completely consistent with science, which is what's so wonderful about it.
Well, it's that we're a process, and he boils it down into heaps and the skandhas. So these are constituent components. When we look at self, really we see nothing outside of those processes and interactions, and that's what we're looking at as a view of self and who we are in modern times. And we're seeing now, of course, a scientific analysis of that with brain scans and stuff like that. And on the philosophical side, I think we've matured more in our approach because we have a wider breadth of teachings to look from to see what's of value and what holds up to practical experience and what doesn't.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's an exciting time to see this confluence of science and spirituality where there's nothing supernatural involved.
So let's talk for a few minutes then about naturalism and how you would, and understand that it's kind of tough to basket it down to a few words, how you would define naturalism, because this question has come up a few times as I have included in some tentative definitions of what, in a positive way, secular Buddhism is. I know that's one of the challenges we have with the atheist community is what's our positive proposition? It's not just we don't believe in God. Okay, that's a negative proposition. What's our positive proposition? We've had this with secular Buddhism as well, is how do we it's not we don't believe in. I would rather have here is our approach to day-by-day existence. And one of the words that I'd included in one of the, tentative attempts at that, was that secular Buddhism is a naturalistic approach. And there were a few questions. So I wanted to raise a little bit of awareness about how that term is being used, in this context. So tell us more.
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Sure. Well, when I talk about naturalism, most broadly, I mean it as a worldview which suggests, based in science, based in empirical ways of knowing, and that's sort of the epistemic background. But the metaphysical content of naturalism is there's nothing beyond the natural world. That there's no good grounds, and that's the epistemology. That's the basis of knowledge, is to suppose that to sign on to the commitment to evidence as the paradigm instance being science, and intersubjective evidence, public evidence, things that we can see and touch and sort of have in common. If we take that as our way of deciding what's true about the world, then we're led pretty much to the conclusion that what exists is nature, as, say, science and other empirical disciplines describe it. So there is this, I think, a rational commitment to public evidence as opposed to personal experience. A rational commitment to public evidence to decide what's there in the world, what's there in existence. And what is there, as far as the public evidence shows, is what we call nature. There doesn't seem to be any grounds for supposing that there's something above or beyond or beneath or besides nature as a separate realm of existence, something that is often called the supernatural. So naturalism is, as a worldview, as a metaphysical commitment or statement, is that there's nothing beyond or besides nature. So that's it in a nutshell. Of course, there are many varieties of naturalism. There's the methodological naturalism, as it's sometimes called, of science, which is to say that we only deal with natural phenomena in deciding how we investigate reality. Okay, well that's fine. I'd rather call it the scientific method.
Yeah, me too.
Because I don't think science presumes naturalism. Science has no metaphysical commitments. It's simply a way of investigating reality that looks at what's publicly available, what anyone in principle could observe. That's what it takes as domain of evidence. If you stick with that, then you're going to end up with nature as the outcome, right? So science doesn't have to talk about methodological naturalism. It can just be science, and if you stick with science as your way of knowing, then generally you're led to naturalism as a sort of metaphysical idea of what's there. So if you diverge from science in any great respect, if you stick with faith, tradition, untutored intuition, hearsay, then you might very well be led to supernatural beliefs, which of course are widespread. The traditional religions are rife with supernaturalism, except for Buddhism, in its, at least in some varieties.
Earlier contexts of practice.
Right. So I hope that's at least some idea of what I mean by naturalism as a worldview. And I often talk now about worldview naturalism as distinct from, say, methodological naturalism or philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism is the idea that philosophy and science are kind of interdependent, to use a word we've used before, co-equal in investigating the world, so that there's no hard and fast distinction between what philosophy does and what science does. So philosophical naturalists tend to be those who respect science and at least look to science as an epistemology which they would take seriously and try to extend to other domains, although empiricism in science is not the whole of naturalist of philosophical naturalism. That gets into some very interesting and difficult questions. But anyway, so there are varieties of naturalism out there. Sometimes there's it's talked about as scientific naturalism, which I think is simply kind of where I'm coming from, which is to look at science as how you know about things, and then the naturalism that comes from that, as I've explained it.
Now, you also, in the book, you make a point of distinguishing naturalism from determinism. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, determinism is the thesis that given the laws of nature and how things are right now, that there's one possible future that could unfold from that. It's sort of a cause and effect view taken all the way, saying that if you knew enough about the world at a particular time, if you were Laplace's demon, as having or God having an omniscient view of everything, then you could see that there was just one possible future for any of us at any time, because everything's determined, cause and effect, by various law-like relations at any point in how events unfold. So if that's a deterministic view, it means that the future, in a sense, is fixed. We're simply living through space-time from our perspective and there's the future is there. In fact, many physicists believe this is the case, although how quantum mechanics fits into it is a little obscure to me, and I don't pretend to have a complete handle on this. But at any rate, a deterministic view simply says that what happens next is fully caused, such that given the situation that you're in right now, there's only one possible thing that could have happened in the next instant. So this, a lot of people think, is a fairly depressing view.
dim view. Yes.
Yeah, right. People don't like determinism. Determinism has got a bad rap. I don't think deservedly so, but that's an interesting discussion in itself.
You do. You talk about that. I'm actually going to quote you now to yourself, because you wrote this very well. You said that by understanding that you are caused, and by seeing just how you are caused, you gain control and power over yourself. Instead of supposing you can just will yourself to be other than you are, stronger, smarter, more altruistic, you understand that self-change and effective action flow from concrete conditions.
The power that comes from understanding oneself as oneself is fully caused is that you understand why you behave the way you did if you understand the conditions out of which your behavior arose. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. The problem that people have with determinism, of course, is that they feel it violates a certain kind of freedom that many people assume they have. Many people suppose that human agents are somehow exempt from cause and effect, and that in the same situation I could have decided other than what I did, even with all factors, including my brain state, being the same. Now, that claim there's no evidence going for it. All the science is against the idea that we have this kind of causal power to transcend the factors and circumstances that we are and that we're embedded in when we make a choice or act, right? So determinism is actually a very first good bet about how we behave and who we are and how we get to be the way we are. Cause and effect, as the Buddha understood, is a powerful, perhaps even true view of how we get to be who we are and why we behave the way we do. So what's not to like?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. And as you said, it gives you the power because yes, there's at the subatomic level, there's stuff going on, and yes, we're constantly in a state of arising and falling away and arising and falling away, that we have this delusion that we are a continuous and unchanging self, when in fact we're changing all the time. That's great, because that's opportunity for us at the conventional level to understand that we still decide. We still get to make decisions.
Right. We as agents don't disappear as real entities in a deterministic world. The big mistake that a lot of people make about determinism is to assign the causes of human behavior a kind of causal priority over human behavior itself, which of course it in turn makes things happen. The important thing to understand about determinism is that there are no inferior events that don't get to have influences after they happen. So human agents and their actions, their deliberative processes, those are still real, and they have real causal effects just as real as the causes that determine them. Okay? The mistake many people make, and it's a mistake that leads them into fatalism, is to suppose that human actions, just because human actions are caused, doesn't mean that those actions don't in turn have causes. We as agents are just as causally powerful as anything else in nature, right? Perhaps more so because our causal capacities involve a lot of self-reflective intelligence that can anticipate events, take simulated scenarios into account, and therefore act more effectively because we can think in advance of action.
Yeah, we can plan.
Right. And all of that is deterministic. But if it weren't deterministic, that wouldn't add power. That's the other thing that people often think, suppose wrongly, that being exempt from causation would give us more power and control, when in fact that's not true. Because if you're exempt from causation, that part that's exempt doesn't have a reason to do one thing as opposed to another. It's simply floating in causal space, disconnected from what came before it, therefore with no reason to do anything.
Yeah, you have even less control over what's going on with that.
Right. But this is an extraordinarily difficult idea to convey, I've discovered. Because most people, seriously, most people in the West are so enthralled to the idea of having to have this kind of contra-causal free will, of being exempt from causation to have control, that it's very difficult to get this idea across. Don't underestimate it. Most people say that in order to have real choices, determinism can't be true. What it means is that they discount the importance of their choice-making deliberative machinery in their own heads that they use every day. They discount that as being causally ineffective, when in fact it isn't. Right. So this is, of course, what we're up against. In promoting a naturalistic worldview, we're up against some very deeply ingrained assumptions about agency.
Well, even in some surprising places too. I'm reading and I won't name it. It's a science Buddhist brain book, and no, that's not the title of it. No, that's in the title. And it's written by folks who have advanced degrees, and they're saying right away, fairly early on in the book, that they have the view that there is something of the self that is transcendent to the natural world. And this is in a book that is representing itself as very hardline scientific. And I don't think they really understand that when you have that view, you're really you're straying off of the scientific method. But there is this, I think, unfortunate premise that we have that statement, that idea that, well, science has to say we're agnostic about supernatural things. And no, we don't. I'm sorry. I disagree with that. Agnostic is, I accept that this could be so. I think that this could be so. I see that as a possibility. And they conflate that with the idea of, but you'd be willing to change your mind if presented with evidence, therefore you're agnostic. Like, no. There's a difference between being open-minded and rationally convinced by evidence, which we should all be in any arena, and saying, no, I think that is wrong. I do not believe that to be so. I still have an open mind. It can be changed, but that doesn't mean that is sometimes taken as you're agnostic, so you're halfway there. No, no, I'm not.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and thank you for raising this point. I think it's good that you take this position, and I share it. There's a difference between being sort of, shall we say, somewhat open to the possibility of something, as opposed to discounting its existence. I discount the existence of God because there's no evidence for it. It's not that I'm agnostic, as you were saying. I'm not agnostic about the existence of the supernatural. Why? Because I don't see any evidence that it's there. So I have no reason to suppose that it might be there. Therefore, I categorically disbelieve in its existence, right?
Right. And we bring up the example of the invisible pink unicorn, because they keep saying, but you could be convinced if we bring an angel, then you'll be convinced. I said, okay, well, let me put it this way. Do you believe in invisible pink unicorns? And they'll say, well, no, of course, it's nonsense. Like, okay, but if I presented evidence for invisible pink unicorns, you could be convinced. And because, of course, they've just pushed their view of what I think not to be in evidence. They say, well, I suppose so. I'm like, great, you're almost there. So you're agnostic about this. You could be convinced. That's halfway to believing. And you're able to use all those same terms. You always got to wait till the end of the conversation when they've used those arguments, so you can just insert invisible pink unicorn or flying spaghetti monster or whatever thing that really isn't in evidence.
Right. Yeah, so I'm not sure how much one wants to make of this argument. Agnostics are there they are. I think they're perhaps supposing that they're being more open-minded and more tolerant and more accommodating, shall we say, to use a word that's been.
Yeah, and in honesty, there are people who are genuinely agnostic. That's fine. They do see that as a possibility. That's okay. It's the idea that if you have an open mind, you have to be agnostic, and that is considered as being close to faith. And I respectfully disagree with that. I think open-mindedness and agnosticism are two different things.
Right. I think where I come down on this is to always suppose that I could be mistaken. That's the kind of the cognitive humility that comes out of being alive with science, right?
Yeah, yes.
Which is why most recently I've come to the idea that naturalism, as I put it, is an empirically plausible conjecture about reality.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's very good. I think I got to quote that.
You see, that puts naturalism on a par with science, as saying, if science discovered, we can't rule it out, that there are entities or processes out there that cannot be subsumed within natural laws. I don't know if this is actually a coherent possibility or not, but let's pretend it is. Then even someone wedded to science and empiricism has to say, to be cognitively humble and to be true to their epistemic commitments, that they could be wrong about the essential nature of reality. We cannot be dogmatic and stand, fists raised, ready to do combat on the grounds that there is only nature. There is only nature. No, we cannot. I don't think we can rightly say, we can't be dogmatic about that yet. At the same time, we don't have to be agnostic about the supernatural. We say, no, though, as far as I can see, there's nothing supernatural out there. I call myself a naturalist in good epistemic conscience, but I'm not being dogmatic about it, and here's why. I'm not dogmatic because we're evidence to accrue that was intersubjective, that was reliable according to all the canons that we use in everyday life, which is, I think, what we're brought to. If you want to convince me of something, you have to use standards of evidence that would convince anyone in sort of everyday affairs. You can't suppose that there's something special about your domain of discourse that allows you to use canons of evidence that don't apply to everyday things. And that's what science does. It goes across the board. It includes the everyday stuff. That's what's so cool about science. That's why I think it has epistemically all the power, because it doesn't carve out a special domain the way some religionists or paranormalists would like to claim. It really is across the board a consistent epistemic position that says, show me the evidence. And that's what Buddha was about. Show me. Don't depend on what anyone's told you.
Right.
Look around.
Yes. As our favorite, the Kalama Sutta has in there, is like you need to go by your own experience and reason, not
right.
What someone told you, not because it was in a scripture, not because everyone else is jumping overboard, right. Whatever it is. That's not a valid approach. Now, one of the things you started talking about, and to me as well, I'm very passionate and excited about scientific ways and naturalistic ways of viewing the world, that there's this misapprehension that people have that to have a naturalistic or mechanistic or scientific, if you want to have a view of this world and what we can show, that isn't inspiring. And to me that makes no sense, because I find the natural world amazingly and endlessly inspiring. Talk to us for a few minutes, because you chat about that in your book as well, about how we can be inspired by this too.
Right. Well, it's in a way it's difficult for me to talk to this, because it's, as you were saying, it's just so obvious that the natural world
is it though? DNA is awesome.
I know. It's just so spectacular. The fact that we cannot comprehend what we're involved in, to me, is almost the most inspiring fact. The fact that it outruns our comprehension. The thing of the problem with religion, traditional religion, is that it almost trivializes, it minimizes the wonder, because it wraps things up in a very neat package where God, is in charge and we know what it's all about. What could be more boring or constraining? There's a wonderful Australian doctor named Jeff Dahms, D-A-H-M-S, Jeff Dahms, who has coined the phrase the wild universe. And he says, I would much rather be in a wild universe than a tame universe. And that's what we've got. We are in a wild universe. We do not know and may never know what's going fundamentally on with existence. That to me is the sort of the astonishing fact. If you're alive with science, if you stick with science, you'll see that it cannot answer certain questions, and it admits as much. That is the cool thing, because the existential questions that are at the heart of human wondering, that science is engaged in probing and may never get to the bottom of, that's what's cool about being alive. It's not that we can wrap things up in a simple, secure package. This is where, I can get emotional and enthusiastic about this, and it's sort of a bias, perhaps, that, you could catch me up and say, well, Clark, you're in love with this wild universe idea. What makes you think it's true? All right. And then you go back to evidence.
Yeah. Let me show you.
Yeah. The evidence says that we don't know what dark energy is. We don't know what dark matter is. We don't know how things really started according to our best way of knowing. So look, we're confronted with these incredible mysteries. Not only that, the amazing mechanics of biology, the quantum mechanics underlying that, the fascinating question of consciousness. What is it? How does it relate to the material world? All of this is fantastic, incredible, fascinating stuff. So what's discouraging about the mechanistic, naturalistic worldview?
Nothing.
Well, nothing. But if you take mechanism, this gets back to our earlier point, if you take mechanism as constraining, as being an affront to your assumption about what you need to be to have meaning and to have power as a human agent. And that comes up all the time. People are affronted. They're afraid and affronted by the idea of mechanism, that we might not transcend physicality. But physicality, let's remember, as physics describes it, has all of these levels of what? We don't know. It goes down to space.
Right.
It goes down to the very bottom of where it ends. We have no idea. This is where, when we talk about physics and materiality, we're actually entering realms that have very little to do with the sort of standard everyday idea of mechanism, right? They go way beyond that. So to talk about ourselves as physical creatures is not to sort of simplify and demean and mechanize in the machine sense. It's to say that we're built on something that we don't know what it is, and we're trying to find out. And it's completely strange and extraordinary that we're here at all talking about it. I mean, so the mechanistic complaint against naturalism, I think, can be answered fairly readily, but only if you sort of open yourself up to the wonders of the natural world as science reveals it. And let's face it, a lot of people aren't there yet.
Right. They're not, and that segues to me in an odd way into a discussion we should have about that dirty word, the S word, spiritual and spirituality. I'm fine with that word. We've used it early on in the history of the podcast. We've talked about that before, and as you've mentioned, Sam Harris also uses that word. You do say in the book, and I'll kind of condense this a little bit, from a naturalistic perspective, spiritual experience is a state of the physical person, not evidence for a higher non-physical realm. Let's talk for a little bit about spiritual and how you use that term and what your thoughts are on it beyond that initial quote.
Right. Well, first of all, from a naturalistic perspective, as what you quoted just said, we shouldn't suppose that spirituality need involve or can involve anything extra physical or supernatural. So why talk about spirituality at all? What's the warrant for that word if you're not dealing with spirit in the traditional supernatural sense? Well, the warrant is, I think, of using the word spiritual is that it captures a set of concerns that is hard to refer to in any other way. You can talk about existential concerns, and I use that word in the book and elsewhere. But spirituality, to me, connotes the encounter with questions of meaning, significance, of value, of it can even extend into the moral domain, but it mostly has to do with our encounter with what is most real and most significant for us. And so I don't want to I think the word, if you're clear to naturalize it up front, which I'm careful to do, and I think Sam Harris does as well, if you're clear to say up front, I have nothing supernatural going here. I want to talk about spiritual concerns in the sense of talking about what is our connection with ultimate reality. What are the potentials for meaning and significance in human life? How do we think of ourselves in the broadest context of our lives? All of this is captured by the word spiritual, and there's another dimension, which is experience. It's the actual experience of being caught up, of amazement, of existential contact. You know, the movie Contact, where Jodie Foster is just overwhelmed by what she's seeing. That's a spiritual experience. And we don't have to go into great detail. Everyone has had these, right? It's almost a platitude to say you go out under the stars and you feel yourself drawn up and connected. Well, I mean, it's a platitude, but it's also true that these experiences are real, they're important, and to call them spiritual is to simply call them kind of what they are, and to take a word from a dualistic tradition and to naturalize it. And I think to naturalize our terminology that way is perfectly fine. It's defensible. We can naturalize morality, we can naturalize freedom, we can naturalize spirituality.
Yeah. You know, there's a moment I'm glad you brought up Contact, and there's a moment in that movie that I think it's precisely what you're talking about. I remember seeing the movie in the theater, and it's the point at which Jodie Foster's in this ball, and it's dropped into the swirling thing with all the energy coming out of it.
Right.
And she starts going through the Stargate, also one of my favorite shows. She starts going through the wormhole, and she goes flying through space, and there's a moment where the ball that she's in kind of pauses for a moment, and it's perfectly clear, so it's just her kind of sitting there, and it's an alien world, and it's nighttime, and she's overlooking it, and there are lights. I mean, there's clearly, it appears like a city, but it's an alien city, it's not us. And there's this look of wonder that I was so happy that they showed that she had on her face, that I felt at being, drawn into the movie, that, wow, that would be just an incredible moment. And these are the kinds of things that Carl Sagan was very inspiring in his talk about this kind of thing, and he was very much a rationalist, that we can still be inspired and have these terrific experiences. We're not saying that you didn't have an experience. People did have experiences, absolutely, and they are terrific and they are transformative experiences. That doesn't mean that our explanations of what that was is necessarily correct when we attribute it to something. We don't know. We are seeing that there are things that we can recreate in the lab, out of body experiences, things like that. It doesn't take away from them being positively beneficial.
Right. And the one thing that's important to point out is that the experience of connection and wonder, although it doesn't refer to anything supernatural, what it does mirror the objective connections that science shows to be the case between ourselves and the rest of existence. So naturalistic spirituality as a feeling state, as a sort of emotional experience, is sort of consonant. It mirrors the scientific truth of connection, which is nice. On the other hand, just to put in a word for the people who don't like spiritual, I think it's fine if people want to explore other vocabularies of other ways to express this. That's fine with me. It could be that another way. Some people have talked about ecstatic naturalism. That's cool. That's fine. On the other hand, though, there's nothing wrong with trying to reclaim a term that already has connotations pointing in the direction that we want to point.
Yeah, language is fluid. We really can have it evolve in an intentional direction is how we want it, because it is something that we get to decide how this happens.
Right, or we can argue for it. Richard Dawkins talks about Einsteinian religion.
Yeah, yep.
So there you go. I mean, and they're religious naturalists, as you know. There's a vibrant community of religious naturalists headed up by scientists like Ursula Goodenough, who's a biologist. And they have no qualms talking about religious naturalism and being religious in that way. So I'd encourage anyone who wants to look it up, go Google religious naturalism. You'll get to some good stuff that way too.
Excellent. Now, speaking of the web, one of the things I want to do was mention that there is an organization called the Center for Naturalism, and I want to just mention to people who are listening to the podcast, the website address for that is www.centerfornaturalism.org. And you founded this group, as I understand it?
Yeah, I'm the director. It's a small nonprofit. It's more of a think tank than anything else. But we do have a board of directors, an advisory board, including Daniel Dennett and others. You can see on the home page there. And our mission really is to promote worldview naturalism, as you'll see in the mission statement. Most of the action happens at naturalism.org. That's where the most of the recent writings and stuff are posted.
Right, and linked on that page is naturalism.org, and I would really direct people to that site as well. It is right there because you have really good resources on that site in particular for people. Yeah,
naturalism.org has been in existence since 1998, so there's a lot of stuff accumulated there in the archives. I like to think that most of it is still relevant. It's interesting how we're so caught up in current developments, but looking back, I think a lot of the stuff on free will, on postmodernism and other things that were more in my focus, 6, 7, 8 years ago are still hold up pretty well. And then there's newer stuff on sort of the epistemology and on theology that have been added more recently, as I and others have tried to respond to the theistic critiques of naturalism. It's interesting that naturalism is now starting to become a bit of a target of religionists. It's not just atheism, and I think that of course to me is a good sign, because naturalism is gaining a little bit more currency. Atheism, as you know, is the main
target, if you will.
Target. It's because of Sam Harrison and Dawkins and Dennett and Hitchens, atheism gets most of the airplay. But of course, naturalism is the underlying worldview and philosophy of which atheism is a small expression of. Atheism is the more or less the denial of the supernatural God. But as we tried to, I think we mentioned at the beginning, we're looking for a positive statement. And naturalism, I think, is that positive statement of a worldview which can deal with everything from your epistemology to your metaphysics to your ethics to your interpersonal relations. I know I'm claiming a lot here, but that's what a worldview is supposed to do, right? A worldview is supposed to be from soup to nuts, and that's what we're trying to put forward at the Center for Naturalism.
And you do it beautifully, and I would say for people who are listening to the podcast, you're like, I'm not so sure about this naturalism stuff, if it's right with my particular practice of a secular Buddhist approach. I'm going to read you a couple things that I'm looking at on naturalism.org. There's a link on the left, spirituality, and as I take a look at what's in there, one of the very first things is an article that was written for the Pragmatic Buddhism, which is the newsletter for the Center for Pragmatic Buddhism. There are links to Stephen Batchelor's site, to thinkbuddha.org, and articles on a skeptical take on Buddhism and things like that. So there is very much a good tie, I think in particular with a secular approach to Buddhism, because we are looking at things from a view of what we see having pragmatic, practical, tangible benefits, not just as a personal level of, I feel better. That's great. And there's more to it. This can also impact just your personal relations and work and spreading out the community, so it can get to a point of what Stephen Batchelor has termed a culture of awakening, that it is a transformative. In fact, he believes that was one of the original intents of the Buddha, was to transform society into something more positive. I think naturalism supports that very well, because it's, show me the evidence. Does it work? Great. Does it not work? Okay, we might want to set that aside. Does it work negatively? We might want to set that aside. Can we show nothing? We don't know if it works or not. Well, okay, we might take a look at this again, but really not so much a priority. We want to work on things that actually work.
Right. Yeah. I think the consonance, the affinity between Buddhism and naturalism is very deep. In the piece I wrote for the secular Buddhist, the pragmatic Buddhist group, I did make one point that I think Buddhists should think about, which is that meditation may not be a route to a direct encounter with reality as it is. Meditation, naturalistically understood, is a brain state. It's which can go along with mental states, experiences that are very rewarding and very powerful. But those experiences don't necessarily reveal the world as it is. I think this is...
keep going. Awesome.
Well, but traditionally Buddhism, I think, has often supposed that the meditative state in achieving enlightenment permits the meditator, the experiencer, to access a kind of knowledge that is direct, that reveals the world for what it is. And I'm skeptical about that claim, because one's own personal experience, one's conscious experience, which is what meditation involves, no matter how deep you go, it's still consciousness being there. I think. I mean, that's a claim, but I'm making it.
Yeah, but
you're
so
still
is
conscious
that it's
when
not.
you're right. What I don't think you can claim is that as a conscious being, that your experience alone, standing on its own, it necessarily reveals. It might, but it doesn't necessarily reveal things as they are, as we, in our best reflective equilibrium, want to claim they are, right? So that I think could conflict with some Buddhist understandings.
I'm with you on that, and this is one of the things that there is, of course, a variety of opinions and personal beliefs in this and experiences in this. And again, one of the things I want to tell people here is that we do have transformative experiences and uplifting experiences during meditation, and that's okay. We're not saying that those are not happening. What we are saying is that in the first place, if we have an experience where we have a vision of Manjushri appeared to us, then that means Manjushri is real. Not necessarily. What that means is we had an experience in which a vision, a visual experience of a particular being appeared before us. That arose in our mind, as I see it, that is a part of our natural processing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that this is an actual entity and I pierced a mystical veil and saw this. And there's an episode where we specifically talked about experiences and what we're attributing them to. I think we do have benefits in particular mindfulness meditation, where we are, and as people view it, may see this as vipassana, that we're not letting our train of thought distract us, and that may be helping us see things more clearly, not in a mystical pierce the veil kind of way, but in I think I'm not going to have 5 beers tonight, as I know that way lies madness, and I need to stay away from that. We're making better decisions. And on the meditation side of samatha, the concentration, which is where we get into those deep joy states, we'll just call them for now without going into a lengthy explanation of jhana, that this can be very uplifting in our mood, and that then we're able to perhaps carry that into our interactions, that's very positive. Again, we don't know that is a piercing of a veil that we can't otherwise show. I am of the camp that this is an event that is occurring within one's brain and body. There's a connection there. I mean, it is all wired together. We do see that in physiology, but it doesn't mean we have transcended and gotten out of that brain body and our pile of skandhas and our heaps. And we see more and more scientific exploration of this. And I've made reference to Michael Shermer. You and I, Tom, were talking about this earlier. You know Michael Shermer, and there's a video I have somewhere on the web for the secular Buddhist about his experiences with the out-of-body brain machine, and that he's had this out-of-body experience and was in a lab, and it's induced by a machine. We can do that. It doesn't mean you actually raised up out of your body and you transcended the physical being. It means that this is a thing that happens within the brain. And that's
right.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well, terrific, Ted. I'm so pleased to hear you say this so clearly. We're completely on the same page, and it's good to hear it, because I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks of secularizing Buddhism is to really look carefully at how we know what we know, and not suppose that meditative states are a direct route, a direct grasping of the world. It's to make the distinction between, as you were saying, what's in consciousness and then what's outside the head. It's it's an important distinction to keep in mind, because and it really that depends on taking a scientific view, basically a naturalistic view of who we are, that we're physical beings, that we don't have a spiritual component that somehow can directly access the noumenal realm or whatever it is.
So, the important things with that is that it doesn't mean or take away one little bit from the practice itself. That it is still a very helpful and beneficial thing every bit as much as if we have the view that, I've pierced reality. Okay, that's fine too, but there's really no difference between me sitting there with my, rational, scientific, reductionist view of things and someone who believes that they have pierced the veil, and perhaps they have, I don't know, I can't show that. We're still having the same experience. And it is still positively impacting our lives in that our moods are better. We're noticing things about how we're thinking because we've been observing what's coming in the mind more, and we've been practicing that as a skill. And we're both, in these two different scenarios, still able to follow what we're saying as the Buddhist path of, okay, so there's cause and effect going on here. You get to decide, and if you want to view this as a karma of I do things and good things happen in a cosmic check and balance way, which I do not hold with that particular view. Or if you look at it in another way of, well, if I take action, then there are within the natural realm causes and conditions and effects that we can see do happen.
Yeah. I think another virtue of meditation, though, is to look into the nature of experience itself. You might, it sometimes happens, you get very rewarding states, what you might want to call spiritual experiences or whatnot. But there's also the hard work of paying attention and seeing clearly that thoughts arise on their own, that that it's very difficult to control one's thoughts, and then also to look at the watcher itself and see that, well, this puzzling fact that the I that you thought you were, if you pay attention, that becomes suspect as well. I mean, it's been very, very interesting quest to discover the watcher. It gets back to David Hume's insight about when he looks at his own experience, he can't find a self-watching. He only sees specific things coming up. So what is this sensation of feeling of being a me? What is that?
Yeah.
Very, very strange. Because it looks like the brain does concoct some kind of ongoing sense of being a me here inside. I feel it fairly strongly. But from a physical perspective, there's no such thing inside. So what is this thing? That the brain concocts, this ego, this I, that we refer all our thoughts to and supposedly directs our actions. So meditation is a way to sort of, try to get into that and maybe question the reality that of the substantial self sitting in there.
Yeah, that impression that I am this, it's this body. Like, okay, so we chop off your finger, you're no longer you. Well, no, I'm still, okay, so at what point, right, as we dissect the self, and not just the physical body, but feeling, positive, negative, neutral, and consciousness itself, and all the mental formations and all that, where is the self? If we take away one component of that, are you no longer there? Like, well, no, there's still stuff, or like that, that isn't really me, that isn't really me, there's no self to be found, and that's still perfectly naturalistic. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can still have that practice and have it be totally naturalistic.
Right, exactly. In other words, we're not getting rid of experience. The reality of experience still holds on a naturalistic worldview. But of course, the very interesting question is, why is there conscious experience given that we're physical brains? A question that I'm really fascinated with and been looking into. It's not immediately obvious how consciousness comes to be on a naturalistic worldview. I don't think that problem has been solved yet. So,
but it's an interesting one, and it's
terrifically interesting, and so
terrific. Lots of things for us to look at. Tom, are you working on another book, I'm hoping, because I really loved Encountering Naturalism so much?
Well, what I'd like to do first is to expand that book, which is, as you know, kind of short. It's a little sketchy, I would say. It does have it has references at the end of chapters to the website and different articles, but even those are somewhat out of date at this point. This was a 2007 publication, so I'd like to update it in light of more recent writings, because I think there has been some progress made in terms of thinking about epistemology and some of the critiques of the theistic arguments against naturalism. So to sort of expand that would be the first thing I'd like to do. Maybe make it a on-demand volume or print on demand and a Kindle version. I think would be good.
Kindle. That's awesome. Good.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So make it, but it has been selling steadily, and I think it's filling a niche, but it could be better. So I want to do that. As to another book, ideally I would like to get a mainstream publisher interested in doing a book on naturalism, because there isn't one out there yet that I know of. I may not be the best person to do the job. There are other people out there who might do it better, and so a little healthy competition would be great. Richard Carrier has his book Sense and Goodness Without God, which is sort of a really in-depth philosophical treatment of naturalism. One thing that we haven't talked about, what I think where I differ with Carrier and some other people is that there are politically progressive implications of taking a naturalistic worldview that I think follow fairly straightforwardly from the critique of free will, because conservatives are very into the idea that people do have the ability to rise above their circumstances and therefore should be blamed if they don't.
Right, it's being used as an excuse to point fingers.
Yeah, and also it figures very strongly in our criminal justice system. Retribution is often justified on the grounds that people could have chosen otherwise than they did, therefore deserve to be punished, even if it doesn't have any good consequences. So retribution, social inequality, attitudes towards mental illness and addiction, obesity, all of these things, I think, lead into or can be critiqued from a naturalistic viewpoint, which would tend to make us more compassionate, more understanding, more aware of the causation, right? That's the basic dynamic. You understand that things are fully caused. You see that people are not self-caused. Therefore, universal compassion, as the Buddha understood it, is seems to me a fairly logical, ethical imperative, or even a psychological outcome of seeing causation, right? Spinoza, other people saw this. They say, if you understand that people really couldn't have done otherwise, then you can't have the same kind of blaming and anger directed at them as you otherwise would on the free will-based view of people, right?
Yeah, and you put a quote by Spinoza towards the end of the book. The mind is determined to this or that choice by a cause which is also determined by another cause, and this again by another, and so on ad infinitum. This doctrine teaches us to hate no one, to despise no one, to mock no one, to be angry with no one, and to envy no one.
Right. I mean, is that amazing? That's a wonderful, wonderful quote. And he's not the last to come to this conclusion, right? Einstein saw it, Darwin saw it. I have some quotes in the book from other celebrities, shall we say?
Yeah, luminaries of the natural.
Right. So the Buddha saw it. He might have been among the first. This is not a new insight. It's perennially seen and then forgotten. And what I would so much like to happen is that other people like yourself and the naturalist community starts to understand this connection and make it explicit. Because it isn't. It's completely hidden in our culture. The critique of the libertarian, freely willing soul and contra-causal agent, supernatural self, is so far as I know, the Center for Naturalism is the only organization promoting this sort of set of ideas. The critique of free will connected to progressive politics and policies and compassion. It's all a package. It's no coincidence that scientists are more liberal than not.
I would agree with that. And I know there's a lot of debate about that because we do have conservative scientists, and yes, there are. We have religious scientists in traditional theistic, faith-based religion. That's true too. We do tend to reach different conclusions, but where I see this, and I'm in agreement with you, is that we don't have these particular political or ideological stances because of anything other than we see this natural progression of cause and effect. And what we want to do is have a world that looks thus, where people get along, and we don't see that ongoing violence and retribution is a way to achieve that end, because we've seen that doesn't work.
It doesn't work, and also we can see that there, in terms of our understanding of the world, their false beliefs can lead to prejudicial attitudes and punitive attitudes. So we have to get our metaphysics about personhood and agency straight, and a naturalistic understanding of agency, of who we are as persons, really, I think, cuts away many of the justifications for often brought up by conservatives for social inequality, for retributive criminal justice policies, for prejudicial attitudes against addicts, for the obese, for mental illness. So anyway, this gets discussed in the book. So
yeah, a wonderful book. Again, for people listening, the book is Encountering Naturalism, a Worldview and Its Uses. The website is www.centerfornaturalism.org. Tom Clark, thank you so much for being here.
Ted, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.